Now, obviously, every game is not literally the same game, right? Well, no. We're going to say that literally every game is, in fact, the same game. Now, of course, literal is a word that means something very specific. So unpacking and sumo wrestling are not the same game. There are, in fact, some differences you might be able to pick out if you look really closely at these photos between these two games. But fundamentally, in a sort of mathematical level, games are all the same, and that's what we're going to explore together for the next hour. We're going to start at a big topic of games themselves, and we're going to get all the way down at the end of this to what I would characterize as the atoms of games. But really what that panel title is something that I found is very effective at the Zenkaikon. So, we are only talking about a certain kind of game. And if you're not familiar, that's Richard Garfield. He wrote some card game that I think some of you have played. But there's a book that him and these two associates wrote quite some time ago. It's basically a textbook. It is called Characteristics of Games. If you have even the slightest interest in what I'm about to talk about, I highly recommend buying that book, Characteristics of Games by Richard Garfield. It is basically game design and theory of games 101. It is a phenomenal book. I've read it cover to cover. Our talks, we cite it so often that you might as well just read that book and you don't need to talk to us anymore. But in Characteristics of Games, one of the things he does is he separates definitions of games so we can have meaningful conversations. You've all encountered the person who tries to say that X game isn't really a game. That's just a walking simulator. That's just a talking simulator. Usually those people only do that because they don't respect that game, or they're homophobic, or they're racist, or they're weird. There's a lot of reasons people do this. There's no real logical basis for that argument. The problem is the word game is super generic. Playing patty cake is a game. Any interactive amusement of any kind is a game. Game also, for hunting waterfowl, that would count. So those nerds are a problem. And to address this, Richard Garfield just made up a word, orthogame. And the word orthogame is used to describe the kind of game we're talking about today. I am not talking about Dungeons and Dragons. We're talking about games that are competitive. We're talking about games where there are winners and there are losers, where you're competing in some fashion. And this definition is fantastic. Ortho games are competitions between at least two players where everyone agrees on the rules, that's very important, and there is a method of ranking those players. That definition describes pretty much every game that anyone would think of as a competitive game. It's a good definition to use. I point out that agreed upon set of rules. That's important because if you don't consent to playing the game, or you don't agree on the rules, you're not actually playing a game anymore. You're kind of just in real life, and someone is causing a problem for you. But this word's really useful. There's a counter word called idiogame, which is broadly used to describe games like, say, Baldur's Gate 3 or Dungeons and Dragons. These are games where you as a player make a series of interesting decisions or a series of meaningful decisions that lead to a personal outcome. Did Karlach survive or not? What happened to Gale? Is Astarion still a vampire? Like, everyone plays these games differently, and that's a very different kind of game that we would talk about with a very different set of words, but everything we're talking about today specifically and solely applies to ortho games. Now what I'm going to give you here, is a framework. Frameworks are, especially in academia, a sort of systematic way of thinking about a topic. But the problem with this framework, you'll find, is that media love it, game designers don't necessarily like it, game analyzers like it, the industry doesn't like it, because this basically boils down to saying that every game is just a combination of some other games. Like, oh hey, you want to play Pal World? It's basically Pokemon plus Fortnite. People who make games often don't like their games to be distilled to that level. And also, there's a lot of concerns about that. But I will say, regardless of anyone's feelings about it, describing games that way isn't just useful, it's actually the seed of the research here. So I'm hoping this will be useful to you. If you're a game player, this is how you'll start to understand better what's happening in the games you play. If you're an aspiring game designer, and I'm sure some of you are, this is how you can start to understand what it is you like about the games you're trying to emulate when you make your game eventually. So I'm going to walk you through two games. And I'm going to say that these two games share the same fundamental mechanic. These games are, for many purposes, the same game. Start with a game called Nidhogg, I talked about the other day. Nidhogg is a game, you're little sword guys, you're trying to beat each other in a little sword fight. So the way Nidhogg works, you have a face-off. You're just in this room, there's a chandelier swinging back and forth, you gotta kill the other guy. As soon as you kill the other guy, you get priority. See that little go symbol up there? Now, your mission is not to kill the guy anymore. You just want to get across to the other end of the screen. You're just trying to run. You're trying to get past this guy. So yellow's just trying to get past orange. You can lose priority. If orange kills you, then they have priority. Now their goal is to get to the other side of the screen. If you make it to the other side of the screen, you're on a second screen, and you play the same game again, but the environment's a little bit different. Do the same thing again, you get all the way to this final screen, and if you get to the end of that screen, you win. And think of this as a series of opposing mini-games. We're playing this game, get priority. We're playing a game in this screen. We're playing a game in this screen. We're playing a game in this screen. You got to get all the way to the end to score a point. If you make it all the way to the left, you're so close to winning, but you don't push it over the line, and the other player makes their way back, you could lose everything. Nothing is scored, nothing matters, and someone hits the end. Let's talk about ice hockey. Here up in Michigan, ice hockey is pretty much my favorite sport. What happens in ice hockey? We've got a hockey rink. It's basically got zones. We're looking at it from the perspective of the team that's about to score a goal here, but just like the yellow guy in Nidhogg. So what happens in ice hockey? You start with the face-off. Someone's got possession of the puck after the face-off. Once you have possession of the puck, then your goal is to move from the neutral zone into the attacking zone. Once you're in the attacking zone, then you have to do something else. Your mission now is to score a goal in that attacking zone. If you don't score a goal, you lose possession, you're going to come back out to the neutral zone. Maybe they're going to push into your defending zone and they're going to score a goal. You don't get points for almost scoring a goal in ice hockey. The Rangers really need to learn a lesson from that. But you don't get points for almost getting to the end of the screen. Nothing matters. It's like this rubber band. You have to pull it until it snaps to score a point by playing a series of discrete mini games. I could apply the same logic to American football. I could apply the same logic to actual football. There are a bunch of games that have this fundamental concept. So whatever this is a core component of all of those games, even though obviously the other parts of those games are different. I'm likely not going to get a concussion playing Nidhogg. At least I hope not. So what is that thing? Well, now we're going to do some math. You may remember in middle school and junior high, depending on what level your schools were teaching at, factorization. Taking numbers, bringing them down to their core components. We're going to factorize some games. I'm going to say that Cobalt Core, we'll explain what these games are in a minute, is just Slay the Spire times FTL. So what are these three games? Cobalt Core, cute indie game. You can buy it on Steam. I highly recommend it. You have a little deck of cards, and you play these cards to control your little ship. Move it to the left, move it to the right, fire a shot, charge the wave cannon, whatever it is you're doing. And you got a little crew, and you basically tell the crew what to do. Fantastic little game, and you pilot your ship through a semi-randomized world until you get to a boss and beat it. You're changing your deck as the game goes along, you're buying new cards, you're destroying some cards. It's that kind of game. Slay the Spire. Fantastic game. You are playing through a dungeon with a deck of cards. Just like Dominion. You know, you've played Dominion, any deck building type game. Just like in the other game, you're building a deck of cards, you're adding cards, you're removing cards, you play the cards to beat monsters, to progress through a randomized dungeon. FTL, another fantastic game, though this game is almost impossible. It is so hard. You're the captain of a ship. It's a real-time strategy game. You are literally saying, like, you go man the shields, you go repair that hole in the hull, you two board the other ship and try to kill those guys. And you're navigating through a randomly generated world to try to stop the rebels from destroying democracy. So all three of these games share something common. And if you haven't played these games, don't worry too much about it because you can apply the same logic to other games you might have played. I do recommend all three of these games. Every one of them is good. But this is the actual equation. Like, this is a serious equation. Cobalt Core is fundamentally Slay the Spire minus the parts of Slay the Spire that don't come along. Slay the Spire, the core of it, the majority of it, like something fundamental about it is coming along here. There are little bits, like this is a fantasy theme, so we've removed that. This game, you don't have movement during your play, so we've removed that. So these minuses are representing the little bits of these games that are their own special sauce, the things that make them unique, that are not fundamental to them as games. The core of Slay the Spire times the core of FTL plus the little bit of special sauce that Cobalt Core has, like the cute characters and the AI cat who's talking to you. That is the equation. However, if I try to do the math with the full equation, it's going to be a little bit dense in here. Kind of like how if you've ever done particle physics, E equals mc squared is the grossly simplified version of that equation, and the proper equation is quite unwieldy, shall we say. So we're going to work from this perspective. So now let's do some proper factorization, because I'm going to say that Slay the Spire is itself just Dominion plus Rogue. So Dominion plus Rogue is Slay the Spire, and fundamentally that is a good component of Cobalt Core. So Dominion, anyone played Dominion? All right, a few people. It was the first deck builder. Deck builder is basically a genre now. That is a game where you draw a head of cards, you basically play the whole hand every turn, and you are buying cards to add to your deck. You change your deck over the course of the game to make it better, to then keep playing the same deck to make itself better until you win. Rogue. Anyone play Rogue? Anyone play a roguelike? So everybody knows what the word roguelike is, but you've never played Rogue. Wait till we get into Metroidvania. So Rogue was a procedurally generated dungeon crawl. You go into a dungeon, and you've just got to make your way as far as you can. The world around you is procedurally, randomly generated, and you have permanent death. If you die, that's it. There's no save games in Rogue. It's just see how far you got. You can't save scum. Some implementations of Rogue will delete the files and make it very hard for you to cheat. So Slay the Spire is just Dominion plus Rogue. But what about FTL? FTL is this cluster of stuff we're going to interrogate in a second, plus Rogue, because both of them fundamentally have this concept of there is a procedurally generated world and permanent death, and you want to see how far you get, and it's different every time. So, therefore, now remember, you did this in school, we can extract Rogue. Cobalt Core is Rogue times Dominion plus that pile of stuff I want to get to in a minute. So this is really important because this is how we extract genres. I used the word roguelike a little while ago because Cobalt Core is a roguelike deck builder where you pretend to be a space captain. This is where these words come from. This is where genres in games come from. They arise because we all recognize, whether or not we realize it, there's something fundamentally the same about these games, and we make up words, and we all agree on those words, even though nobody said, this is the definition of roguelike. Well, there is a website. So there's something called the Berlin interpretation. These nerds have written infinite volumes trying to define what a roguelike is. And I'm going to say that is an exercise in futility. Richard Garfield, that word orthogame, he said something else that was very profound, and this is something you can apply in your lives in general. When you are trying to understand something new or describe something new, don't get hung up on very strict definitions, because that is the way of madness. That is how that guy is going to be a problem. That's a gender-neutral term, but you've all met that guy. That guy is going to say, well, technically, and then you're going to have a problem. So rather than being prescriptive by formally defining these terms, that comes later. That comes in deep academia. Be descriptive. Describe what you see. Orthogames describe what he sees in a certain class of game. Roguelike describes what we see. We don't need a 1,000-page dissertation on what roguelike means. Every one of us who has played a roguelike game has an understanding of what roguelike is. It's a useful word. We can proceed with it. So thus, this is where genres come from. This is the math everyone who plays games is already doing, whether they realize it or not. What about that stuff over there? Well, there's two things going on there. Broadly, that's theme. Whenever you find a cluster of stuff that's irreducible or hard to break down further, remember in your school math classes, usually that was the hard problem you're going to get wrong. That's the difficult part. That's where complexity lies. Here, what we've got is the theme. Because being a ship captain in Cobalt Core is mostly thematic. You're actually just playing the cards. It's not like FTL where you're ordering one person to do X and one person to do Y. But the rest of this is, Command and Conquer, a real-time strategy game. The people who designed Cobalt Core, they said the game was inspired by being the captain of a ship, like in Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica, the board game and the show, and real-time strategy games like Command and Conquer. because FTL is a real-time strategy game. So we could break that down further, but we don't have a name for that genre. No one's going around saying, oh yeah, I'm playing a ship captain-like. If there is a critical mass of games that are similar enough, or there's some core mechanic that people really jive with, a word might emerge from that space. A word has not emerged yet because there is no consensus there. But all that means, Cobalt Core is a roguelike deck builder where you get to play a space captain. So let's keep going. We're going to go way deeper here because Rogue is really, and this is stated, the people who invented Rogue, who designed this game, they said it was based on the experiences they had playing Colossal Cave Adventure and Dungeons and Dragons. So Rogue is just Colossal Cave Adventure, a game where there is a dungeon and you explore it and solve puzzles. It's one of the earliest adventure games. It recently got a VR re-release, actually, and it's a pretty important game. I don't know if you need to play the original necessarily, maybe just read about it or watch a stream, but go into a dungeon. Dungeons and Dragons. Make up a dungeon. Make up a guy. Make up stuff. Dungeons and Dragons added the procedural element, except it didn't have a computer doing it. It had the dungeon master doing it. So Rogue has automated the dungeon master of D&D to then have you go through an infinite number of caves. It's fundamentally just that. What if we go even deeper? What's D&D? No one has ever raised their hand, but I'm very curious. Has anyone played Chainmail? Okay, I have not even played Chainmail. I've read it. Chainmail was the precursor to Dungeons and Dragons. Chainmail is the game that Gary Gygax was involved in that eventually became Dungeons and Dragons. Chainmail was medieval combat with a fantasy theme, even though that was technically a supplement that was added to Chainmail later. So Chainmail was this idea that you can have rules to govern which army wins in a big epic fantasy battle. And then as they played this game, they found it was more fun to focus on the heroes, to focus on Legolas instead of all the orcs. And then they'd start improving and adding a little bit more role-playing rules. And that eventually led to the Dungeons and Dragons that you know today. So what if we go even deeper? What's Chainmail? So Chainmail is basically a Kriegspiel, a war game. Old Prussian people would play war games to plan actual wars. War games are games. They are serious. They're interesting. They're a big part of gaming history. And Chainmail is fundamentally just a war game plus Tolkien. It's got a fantasy medieval theme, but it is mechanically effectively identical to all these serious war games that people would play in, well, basically since the dawn of time. They particularly became a thing during the Franco-Prussian War, the Napoleonic Wars, and they are still a big part of warfare to this day. So what's a war game? Well, a war game, these were basically ways to try out war strategies without killing people. So really, all a Kriegspiel is actual war plus dice. Instead of actually having your units kill each other, they're almost doing like war practice, and you're using a game, you're using these rules, you're rolling dice to see, yeah, you hit the shot, you killed that guy, all right, let's go. Oh yeah, your army got cornered, like that's what happened. So Kriegspiels are really just real warfare minus the death, plus dice to replace the death, dice to decide what actually happens. If we go in further, if I got dice, how do I reduce that? Are dice the bottom? Is dice, like the concept of rolling dice to get a result, is that the bottom of game design? Can we follow this chain all the way back out to Cobalt Core and it's one contiguous chain? If so, if dice are just made up of individual die, then what the hell is deeper? What do we do next? Is there a bottom? How many of you think there is a bottom? All right, interesting. A few of you are pretty confident and everyone else is very unsure. So let's explore what's going on at the bottom here. Now, selfishly, because I don't want to give through this whole spiel again, I'll link to these slides from our website after the show, but we did a talk on worker placement games. We took the mechanic of worker placement, the genre of worker placement, and we did an hour-long talk just on the math of worker placement. However, in the first 10 minutes of that, we explained what a game mechanic is. It would take me too long to explain that right now, but game mechanics are effectively the bottom. Deck building is a game mechanic. The procedural generation that you know in a roguelike, that is a game mechanic. Games are basically constructed of one or more game mechanics. So at least so far, game mechanics are the bottom. Cobalt Core has the mechanic of deck building. It has the mechanic of driving your ship. It has a series of mechanics. Think about any game you like. You could start listing all the mechanics. And while you might be wondering, well, what's the definition of a game mechanic? What did we just say before? If you would think it's a game mechanic, it probably is. Does anyone disagree that worker placement is a game mechanic? It's descriptive. It works. We use these words. But what game mechanics fundamentally are the atoms of games. These are the fundamental components that create games. Games are almost the chemistry of mechanics. A single mechanic by itself, like punch for punch. You all played punch for punch as a kid? That uses the mechanic of punching. You could make a more complex game out of punching, like, say, ice hockey or boxing. So you can take the fighting in ice hockey and drill it all the way down to punch for punch, and we're fine. But if these are the atoms of games, I think some of you, because I saw someone make a little frowny face, that's the kind of thing you do in the audience of a panel like this, you're thinking in your brain, but what about quarks? Why did he say atoms? Does he not know about quarks? And we've got some time left, so of course, we're going to talk about quarks in a little bit. So let's go deep into what I would consider a single mechanic game. We're going to pick a game mechanic, and we're going to talk about a game that only has one ingredient. There is just one mechanic. That game is called Yahtzee. Has anyone not played Yahtzee? Okay, I would recommend playing Yahtzee. There are plenty of places you can play it online for free. And there's some notable things about Yahtzee. One, you as a human, anyone in this room, you can play this game perfectly. And it won't even take you that much time to learn how to do it. There is a website, it's probably gone by now, but there used to be this website that you could go to, and it would just keep letting you play Yahtzee. And every time you finished making some Yahtzee decisions, it kept this counter showing you how close to statistical perfection you were playing. And it is possible to be basically perfect at this game. You can be good at Yahtzee. People who are bad at Yahtzee struggle in a lot of other games, because another important thing about Yahtzee, this is a single mechanic game. I will argue that Yahtzeeing is itself a game mechanic. But Yahtzee-like mechanics appear in a lot of other games. A lot of board games have a thing that's basically just Yahtzee happening. So as a result, Yahtzee is a really interesting space to examine. If you want to start studying games, Yahtzee is a really good place to start. If you want to get really good at games, if you want to be very good at games, Yahtzee is also a really good place to start. Because if you learn how to be good at individual game mechanics, then anytime those mechanics, or mechanics like them, or versions of those mechanics, are in games that you are playing, you will not have to worry about that part of the game. You'll just play it well, and you can focus on the other parts of the game. So what if we try to distill Yahtzee? And remember, all you're doing in Yahtzee, you roll 5 dice, you decide how many you want to keep, you re-roll the rest, you decide how many you want to keep, you re-roll the rest, and whatever's left, that's what you score. There are simpler versions of Yahtzee, but they're basically just the same game, either with fewer dice or fewer scoring options, fewer things to do. They are smaller. They're almost like an isotope of Yahtzee, a simpler isotope of Yahtzee, but they're fundamentally the exact same game. What if we go up? What if we make the uranium of Yahtzee? Well, that's Roll Through the Ages. Roll Through the Ages is like a civilization game in theme, and it's got a bunch of stuff going on. But fundamentally, this game is just advanced Yahtzee. There is almost no other mechanic except doing more complicated Yahtzee with more dice and more stuff coming out of the Yahtzee pool. So we've got all these games that are basically the same game. So one can argue, if we're talking about atoms, we are at the bottom. This is a game mechanic. Any game that just uses this mechanic is really fundamentally the same. So here we go. Now we're getting into the quirks. We're getting into the fun stuff. What is Yahtzee made out of? If Yahtzee is a game mechanic, what am I going to say Yahtzee is made out of? Am I going to start talking about the mechanics of throwing dice and physics? No, that's not the important part of games. Yahtzee is fundamentally luck plus math. Now, what do I mean by that? If you are good at Yahtzee and you play Yahtzee perfectly, I can play Yahtzee perfectly, absolutely, and I will prove it to anyone if you want to see. If you can play Yahtzee perfectly and I can play Yahtzee perfectly, we're still rolling dice. Just like in a poker tournament, you could be the best poker player in the world. You might just draw 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 over and over and over again, and you're screwed. Just because you are playing something perfectly doesn't mean you'll win. That's a lesson we've learned from Star Trek to real life. So Yahtzee, even if you make perfect decisions, no one could fault the decisions you made, the game will then come down to luck. So another way to look at this, if we invert the equation, luck is what remains when you've accounted for the math, or in this case, the skill. Yahtzee is testing you on one thing. Can you do basic statistical math? If you are good at doing basic statistical math, then you can't be better at Yahtzee. You are perfect at Yahtzee. Luck determines the rest. However, if you are not perfect at basic statistical math, you're going to win Yahtzee less often. The luck will be there, but you almost like haven't bought a seat to the table. So you have to be good enough at math to get to this point, and then luck makes up the remainder of whether or not you win. So what is luck? Luck is a difficult question to answer. Luck is kind of the crux of all this. And now we're getting into what games are made of. Games are made up, game mechanics. Let's be very specific. Game mechanics are nothing more than one or more tests. We don't know the outcome. A mechanic is going to decide the outcome, and then we proceed knowing that outcome. So Yahtzee determines something about the universe, about the game, about whatever. All game mechanics are made up of tests. There are no exceptions. And this is where it gets tricky. As far as we can tell, and if anyone has a counterexample, if there's research out there, I'd love to see it, there is a finite number of possible tests, and even worse, many of these tests, much like quarks, is anyone familiar with particle dynamics in quarks, like the actual reality of how they work? Okay, not as about the number of hands I expected. Basically, quarks have generations. Even though there are different kinds of quarks, some of them are basically generations of each other. They're fundamentally identical, they just have different masses. So what I'm about to go through, one by one, are every single test we can find in games. I do not believe there are further tests. However, even worse, some of the tests we're about to talk about are in many ways arguably the same as some of the other tests I'm about to talk about. They're just looked at in a different way. This is a long way of saying games boil down to a very small number of very simple components. Test number 1, randomness. We use this a lot. Actually random. You have no control over the outcome. This is at the core of a lot of games. Poker, randomness matters way more in poker than skill. Once you've got enough skill to get above the line, then it's just randomness. So randomness is specifically when we cannot know the outcome. We might be able to make an assumption or an observation about the likelihood of a different outcome. That's just statistics. But ultimately, regardless of that likelihood, if we're not sure, if we don't know and we can't know until we roll the dice, then that is a random outcome. A lot of games end up being random at the end of the day. Most tabletop board games you have ever played, if you enjoy them and they're fun, but you play them a lot with smart people who are as smart as you and you all get better at the game, you'll eventually hit this dead end where the game is just random and there's nothing else you can do beyond that. Test number 2, similar to random, but this is very distinct. I have this picture of a Nintendo 64 up for a reason. Is anyone good at the N64 version of Smash Brothers? Yeah. I see some pros back there. In Smash Brothers, what do you think happens? And the people who raise their hands, don't answer if you know, because I want everyone else to. So what happens if you're playing the same character, you're standing like a distance apart where you could both hit each other on a flat surface, there's no items, there's no nonsense, nothing, and you both hit attack at the exact same moment, the same frame. You are both Neo in the Matrix, you are both playing perfect Smash Brothers, and you have hit attack at identical frames. Your two attacks are indistinguishable. They cannot be ordered. What happens? Oh, we have an answer possibly. What happens?
Whoever is player 1 is going to take priority.
That is correct. Port priority. If you're plugged into that port right there, guess what? You win. Because it is arbitrary. That test, the answer to that test was determined in advance and is known. If you know the source code of that game, you already know that answer. Candyland is another game that you could argue it's random or arbitrary. If you haven't played Candyland, the rules are simple. You shuffle a deck of cards. At every turn, player draws a card, and it tells them where to move. And eventually, someone gets to the end and they win. There are no actions players can take. There are no decisions players can make. It's still a game. It is technically still an ortho game. You can have ortho games where no player has any agency over the outcome. Maybe that's not a great game for an adult, but it is a game. But the outcome of that game, you could argue it's random. Because if you haven't looked at the deck of cards, you don't know who's going to win until you play the game. However, you don't have to actually play the game. You could just flip over the cards one by one, and you will see which player would win. So the outcome was already determined and already known. Candyland is still random only because in the rules of Candyland, you're not allowed to look at those cards until someone takes their turn and reveals it. So the only way to know who won Candyland is to reveal the cards one by one. Arbitrary, you can know this in advance. It is very likely many games that are what we would consider serious skill games, games like chess, games like Go, they edge into arbitrary because there is a known answer to them. Tic-tac-toe has an answer. And thus we talk about a generation of those games, perfect information games, chess, Go, checkers, all those kinds of games, tic-tac-toe. These games are solvable because they exclude randomness. There is nothing random that happens in these games. The result of the game, the result of this series of tests is the result of the actions the players took and nothing else. Every action is known, nothing is hidden. We see everything. We're gods when we play Go. And yet no one's perfect at Go. We haven't solved Go. We might never solve Go. So what's going on here? Because the game is just basically one big equation, one big set of states, then we could, if we mapped out every state, figure out the answer to these games. We do know the answer to checkers. Checkers was solved about a decade ago, actually about 15 years ago, I think, at this point. And checkers, if no matter how you play, both players can force the game to a draw no matter what. If one player can play the game perfectly and does not want to lose, they can absolutely force the game to be a draw no matter what. No one can stop them. There is no amount of skill, there is no decision you can make to prevent them from forcing a draw. But you have that same power. You can also force a draw. Neither player can force the game into a state where they win. So if the game is played perfectly, a draw is the best possible outcome. You're never going to win against a perfect opponent because they won't let you. These games are solvable, but there's a big difference in physics between solvable and solved. If you don't understand that, check out the 3-body problem. So as a result, perfect information games can still be fun and interesting because even though there are AIs that basically play Go effectively perfectly, they're not perfect. They do not know the answer to Go, but they know how to beat any human brain that will ever try to play Go. But at the same time, I can play Go with someone who's as dumb as me and have a great time. So just because a game is solvable and just because a game is solved does not mean that you, the player, has that knowledge, has solved the game, and thus the game is still good. This is not saying Go is somehow bad because we can solve it someday. We're just saying that it is a solved game. It is fundamentally the same as tic-tac-toe. Now this overlaps with what we just talked about, but I would argue there is a distinct class of games that are testing whether or not specific arbitrary knowledge is in your brain as a player. Think about Trivial Pursuit or Double Dare, not the physical challenge, but the Double Dare part of Double Dare. The game is literally just testing, like if you have a copy of Trivial Pursuit, that game is testing, Does your brain contain the information that an average adult would know in the year 1978, because that's how old your family's copy of Trivial Pursuit is? These games actually present an interesting and difficult design space, because games that fundamentally rely on knowledge in someone's brain that is arbitrary tend to be very binary in their result. You ever go to bar trivia and there's someone who knows the answers to everything and you don't know the answers? That's like playing Street Fighter against someone who's good at Street Fighter. You don't even have a chance, because it's not a matter of, you can't think hard and come up with the answer. You just can't. You're not going to have it. Now, arguably, if I know the answer to checkers, then checkers, a perfect information game, is just a knowledge game. There's very little difference between these two, except we could make the distinction. This one is saying an answer is possible. An answer does exist even if we don't know it. And this is saying the game is testing whether or not the individual players know that answer. And while Go is ostensibly testing whether or not one of the players knows the answer, we know that no human being knows the answer to Go at this time and likely never will. So it does make sense to make a distinction. Now, sport. This is actually the one we could go a lot deeper on. We don't really have time to. But what is a sport fundamentally? Sports are not just testing whether or not you can make a good decision and know the answer to something. They're testing whether or not you can execute something in the real world physically. Chess is not a sport because a good way to look at it, if I tell someone else what I want to do in chess, but they make the move for me, that doesn't change the outcome of the chess game. If I'm on the ice playing hockey against the New York Rangers and Wayne Gretzky tells me what to do, that is not going to help me win at ice hockey. This is a really, really messy area here. This is an area you could do a whole talk on separately. But think about what sports are really testing. At the low level, normal human beings in a normal town playing normal sports. They are testing if you have developed certain specific skills. They are testing if certain parts of your brain have built certain kinds of heuristics for you to engage with the world. They are testing how fast you are. They're testing how strong you are. How far can you run? I went for a 9-mile run yesterday after my panel, because I'm a nut, that's what I do. I was testing, can I run 10 miles? The answer was no. I petered out at 9.5. But sports at the high level, because remember, we're talking about ultimate tests here. So what about perfect play? What if we're doing a foot race or a bicycle race or a swimming race and the two people competing are doing it perfectly? So the game's testing technique, but technique can be mastered. Ultimately, at the highest levels, sports are testing things we are uncomfortable testing or maybe aren't appropriate to test. We are testing genetics. We are testing luck. We are testing not just luck of whether or not you reacted to the starting gun a microsecond for the other person. We're testing whether or not you had the luck to be born in a rich country. We're testing whether or not you had access to training and skills. If the top athletes in the world are broadly in sports that have fully maximized, not all sports have this top tier of play, but like ice hockey, the best hockey players in the world are cultivated through, they play hockey their entire lives. They grow up in families that give them access to play hockey. They live in a place where there's ice to play hockey on. They also happen to have won the genetic lottery. They have big lungs, they have big legs, they're really tall. Those are the things we're fundamentally testing in sports. And going too deep into trying to ascribe skill or value into those things starts to miss the mark. The point of sport, this is sort of an aside from the theory, is that we like doing it and we like watching other people do it. We should be doing it for fun and enjoying it, and the awards and winning and losing are just part of that ceremony. But if you push sports too far, bike races just become who had a genetic mutation that gave them bigger lungs and longer legs than someone else and happened to be born in a rich country to rich parents and happened to not get hit by a bus when they were a kid. That's ultimately what sports are testing at the extremes. All right, now this is politics in game theory. I'm not talking about the shameful results of the US election. I'm not talking about like the danger we're all in. This is politics. This means something different in game theory than in real life. Politics in game theory is something that occurs in all games that have more than 2 players or more than 2 teams of players where the players can interact with each other. You have all experienced politics. If you ever played Settlers of Catan, and your less intelligent friend made a trade with the person who you were going to beat that was a bad idea, and then they won because of it. That was politics. You couldn't stop that trade. Your skill, you were the most skilled player at Settlers of Catan, but all your idiot friends did a bunch of stupid trades, and now your idiot friend won. All games where players can interact have politics to some degree. This is another deep topic we could get into. Politics effectively boil down to in games vote who wins. Think about if you're playing a Risk. I attack my friend Scott because I got to attack someone. It's the first round of the game. Then it's Scott's turn. He attacks our friend Pete. Then it's Pete's turn. Pete attacks Scott. Scott's been attacked twice. Pete's only been attacked once. I've been attacked 0 times. Then we keep going around. Whoever gets attacked more times is just going to lose. That's how Risk always goes down. There is nothing you can do about it. If the players, based on their personalities or their randomness or the fact that they're mad at you because you won Risk yesterday, decide you're not going to win, you're not going to win. Games can have more or less politics. And this chart, this is why I recommend this book, Characteristics of Games, so much. This is one of the charts from the book, and it shows on this axis we have the return on skill, meaning if you have skill in this game, whatever skill means, then you are more likely to win. You get a more return on using that skill. If I'm really good at hearts, I'm more likely to win hearts. But as we add randomness to a game, the return on skill decreases. The more random a game is, the less I get out of my skill. If I play hearts, my skill matters a lot. If I play poker, my skill matters a lot less because there's a lot more randomness in poker. As randomness increases, the return on skill decreases, and this axis, politics increases. Once the game is just random, once players get no further meaningful return on their skill, the only thing that determines who wins is effectively all the players deciding, whether they realize it or not, who's going to win. If you ever play Munchkin, it is literally just that. You sit down and you're just voting who wins. And thus I have some advice for you. If you play Munchkin or a game like it, you're going to recognize a dark pattern that happens in political games. The dark pattern is this. Rym's about to win unless the next player stops him. So that player stops him. Then someone else is about to win unless the next player stops them. And the game is just, is someone going to stop the next person? No one can do something to win. All they can do is do something to make this terrible game continue. So you need to understand the mission. And I learned this mission by playing the VHS Star Trek game with Laurent Gauran. There's a VHS Star Trek game. It is objectively awful. It is so awful, it is actually brilliant. And I think it teaches real Starfleet principles. And I refuse to explain that further. But if you were stuck in a game like that, a game like Munchkin, your mission is not to win, because you can't win. It's random. Your mission is to make the game end. And then you can all play something else. So I highly recommend, if you were stuck in that situation, maybe don't play the whack-a-mole and let someone else win the game. Because who's going to remember who won that game of Munchkin 10 years from now? And if you know someone who will, you should probably stop being friends with them. The even darker one. A lot of games are effectively not even, forget genetics, everything else, they are just testing how much wealth you have. If you've played Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic the Gathering in different eras, you've experienced this. A lot of miniatures games are like this. Games like Marvel Snap, if you don't keep spending money, you're not going to have enough cards to play in the meta. A lot of games, fundamentally, are testing the wealth and resources of the players. Meaning the game started before you sat down at the table. Meaning you already lost. The game was rigged from the beginning. So again, this overlaps with all those other tests, but I think it is important to make this distinction that tests of wealth exist because this is where some of the deepest problems in games and society exist. Or ultimately, the universe. So a test, what did I say before we got into this test thing? Tests are, we do not know the answer to something. We're going to go through some procedure, and at the end of that procedure, we will have an answer. We're playing Dungeons and Dragons, the game I said we wouldn't talk about. I want to hit that guy with my sword. We're going to roll some dice, we're going to do some things, and then we're going to find out, did you hit that guy with the sword? Games, you have to go through the motion of performing the test to get the result. And I don't think there are other tests than these that exist, this very short list, many of which overlap. So there's two ways to look at this. One, if you find a fundamental test in games that is not on that list, it might be new math. Game theory is how we have found, as humans, a lot of new kinds of math that help us solve new kinds of problems. The math of quantum physics is really messed up and really weird. So if you find something that is so irreducible that you can't map it to one of these other tests, you might have stumbled onto a mathematical problem. It might be solvable, it might not. But there are more hidden mathematical problems out there than you might realize. It is very likely, if you pay attention to games, you will encounter a math problem where you think, oh, I couldn't figure out the answer, that's weird. And if you interrogate it more, your math professor might say, oh yeah, that's Joey Jojo's conjecture from 1745 and no one's ever solved it. But another way to look at it, games fundamentally are testing the state of the universe, because they are testing what happens in your game of Settlers of Catan, which is in the universe. So what if the game you're playing is guess the quark? What if the game you're playing is guess the next digit of pi? Games are testing the universe in a fundamental way. We're just putting constraints around them because we're doing it for fun. But games are fundamentally simulatory. They are, I don't want to get too deep into this whole philosophy, but basically, any simulation of something must contain some element of the thing it's simulating. I refuse to explain that statement, but trust me on this one. Simulations must contain something from the world from which they came, the place where that simulation came from. So if you were playing a game, no matter how abstract, no matter how, whatever this game is, it is fundamentally reflecting something about the world you live in, and as a result, it is a simulation where you can glean some insight, some knowledge. You can learn things about the world by doing simulations. And if you disagree with that, I'm going to go all the way back to something very important. These Kriegspiels, these war games. These games won and lost wars. There are militaries that use wargaming, and there are militaries, the Japanese military during World War II, there was an example of this, where they cheated at their own war games. There is a famous story ahead of the Battle of Midway where the Japanese fleet was conducting serious war games to simulate different outcomes of that battle. And they cheated at the game to make sure they won for a bunch of reasons. And that didn't happen in real life. So playing games seriously, like the Prussians did and the Napoleonic era generals did, that can teach you things about the world. War games work. That's why they're such an important part of war. We can have the equivalent of war games for other things. There are a lot of games today that are simulating, let's say, better societies, better economic systems, better political systems. Those are not perfect. You can't take the politics of trade in Settlers of Catan and extrapolate too much into the real world. But you can gain some key insights from that. An example I can give you that's very specific. Has anyone played a game called Power Grid? Famous board game? All right, a few of you. So Power Grid, pretty good game. But the game was based, and Friedman Freese, the designer, released a new version called Power Grid Outpost. Some slight improvements, some slight changes. The game is fundamentally an engine builder. You are building a machine. A lot of German board games, you build a machine. Cubes come in, more cubes come out. I put those cubes into the machine, even more cubes come out. I put those cubes in the victory point part of my machine, victory points come out. Those games have a fundamental problem in that they snowball. If any one player gets a little bit ahead, they are going to be infinitely ahead before long. Once you're ahead, you keep getting ahead. That's just something that is observed in that kind of game. Capitalism, arguably, has a very similar problem. So Power Grid was an attempt to still have the fun of building the machine and trying to make the efficient machine. But Power Grid introduced taxes. He even calls them taxes into the game to slow down the fastest player, and thus the game becomes something fundamentally different. We're no longer testing who can make the most brutally efficient machine at cranking out victory points at all costs, and now it's who can, within the constraints of this almost regulatory framework, this series of taxes and controls, who can make the machine that is most efficient without pushing into those extremes and thus falling apart. And That is how you can start to design and explore better systems for things in general. So over the course of the last, we've got about 10 minutes left, so we'll be able to take some questions. Where did we just go? We covered a lot in this talk. And I think the things you should really take away are that, one, if you like games, if you like ortho games, I recommend thinking about them and taking them a little seriously. Try to learn more. Try to interrogate what it is you like about them. I'm not saying you have to ruin games for yourself. If you love Smash Brothers, don't get to the point to where you're obsessing over frame timings and you stop having fun, unless you're winning money, in which case, Godspeed. But you don't have to professionalize, but at least understand and interrogate what you like about games, and especially if you find you're not happy playing a game. Say you find that you get really upset when you lose a game of Smash Brothers, as we've seen some people at conventions. Interrogate why, because if the game is just a simulation, then one way we use simulations is just to see what happens. It should be fun to lose a game. So if a game that you win is more fun than the game that you lose, then either there's something wrong with the game design or there's something wrong with how you are enjoying the game. So these are the kinds of things you can do just to make your own experiences in games better. If you care about winning, irrespective of what I just said, if you study games a little more closely and think about what these core mechanics are in these games, you're just going to start getting better at games. You're going to start getting a lot better at games. I am not kidding. If you're good at Yahtzee, you will get really good at almost any tabletop game, to the point that maybe your friends won't play with you anymore, and now you have a different problem. But in terms of these tests, this is actually something fascinating. Think about how the world works. We have these tiny, extremely simple things, atoms and quarks, this very, very simple set of a small number of objects, and yet only in aggregate does the world around us exist. Temperature, the concept of temperature does not exist if you zoom in far enough. Temperature only exists when there's a bunch of molecules. There's really not such a thing as temperature if you're just zoomed into one molecule. So if you try to zoom in on every game you play to this level, that might not actually be that useful, other than as an academic exercise. But where it is useful is understanding that these are the core components that themselves build up a much more complex thing. Because these tests make game mechanics, but then a set of game mechanics make good games. So if you start to understand which of the game mechanics you like and don't like, which ones you find interesting and not interesting, then it'll be very easy for you to figure out what games you'll like next and what games to play. And if you're a designer, then you won't make the mistake most people make of liking a game, not understanding why they like it, trying to design a game similar to it, and then finding it's deeply unsatisfying. Instead, you'll figure out the part of Slay the Spire I like is the deck building part. I am making a deck builder, and that gives you a framework from which to operate. But anyway, I hope this was enjoyable for the last 50 minutes or so.